9-year-old Artem ran out of the entrance like a ball released from squeezed fingers. The rain had just stopped, leaving silvery puddles scattered all over the asphalt. The air smelled of wet earth, gasoline, and freshness. He greedily inhaled it, took a running start, and stomped into the largest puddle near the bench. The dirty water splashed in all directions, and Artem listened with pleasure to the satisfying squelch under his sneakers. He was about to repeat the maneuver when something made him stop. For a moment, he thought he saw something other than his own reflection in the churned water surface. Not his own round, juice-stained face with carefree eyes. He leaned over, curiosity taking over. The water gradually calmed. First, the usual features, and then, something went wrong. The face in the puddle elongated, became narrower. The hair, dark like his, suddenly turned yellow and thinning, forming a bald spot on the crown. The boy stepped back a step, blinking in confusion. It's a trick of the light, he thought. He crouched down again, carefully, as if sneaking up on a bird. The reflection returned, and again, it was the old man. His face was pale, almost transparent, and his eyes were two dark abysses, full of such deep sorrow that Artem felt cold inside. The old man in the water raised his hand, slowly, with visible effort, and pointed a finger somewhere behind Artem's back. Artem turned around sharply. Behind him was only the usual courtyard landscape, a playground, benches, a few parking spaces. Nothing unusual. His heart beat faster. He looked at the puddle again. The old man hadn't disappeared. His finger was still pointed in the same direction, but now his lipless mouth opened, and Artem thought he heard, just at the edge of hearing, a hissing, "Look!" The boy jumped back from the puddle as if burned. He felt awkward and scared. What was that? A hallucination? A trick of the imagination? But the feeling of cold under his skin didn't go away. He ran home without looking back, but the feeling that someone was watching his back from 1,000 tiny water eyes didn't leave him. At home, everything was normal. Mom was cooking dinner, Dad was watching TV. Artem tried to tell them about the strange puddle, but the words got tangled. "You imagined it, son," Dad said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Everything looks different after the rain," Mom added. "Probably a reflection of the clouds." Artem fell silent. He knew it wasn't that. He had seen the old man's eyes. They were more real than any clouds. The night was restless. He had nightmares where he was drowning in a deep puddle, and from the depths, the old face watched him, and his own screams were muffled by the water. He woke up in a sweaty shirt, with a clear sense of danger. The next day, walking to school, he tried to avoid puddles. But they were everywhere, and every time he glanced at them, he thought he saw, for a moment, not himself, but the shadow of a wrinkled face. It was faster than a blink, but enough to feel the same cold horror again. After school, he stopped by that same puddle near the bench. It was smaller, but still there. His heart pounded. He mustered his courage and approached. The water was calm. At first, he saw himself. An ordinary boy. He breathed a sigh of relief. But suddenly his own reflection wavered again. The features began to stretch, to age. In a matter of seconds, the old man was before him again. Today he looked even more exhausted. Under his eyes were dark, blood-filled bags. He opened his mouth again, and this time Artem heard more clearly, though very quietly, as if the voice was coming from under the water. 3 days? The voice was dry, like rustling leaves, slow and heavy. Artem covered his ears with his hands, but the words echoed inside his head. "What 3 days?" he whispered, leaning over the puddle. The old man's face contorted in a grimace of pain. He raised his hand again, but this time not just pointing, but drawing some sign in the air above the water. It was a bizarre, broken line, like lightning striking the ground. "Fire," the old man hissed, and his image began to blur. Fire from the sky. The puddle became ordinary again. Artem sat on his wet knees, trembling. Fire from the sky? 3 days? It sounded like threats from a bad movie. But the horror in that old man's eyes was real. It was familiar. Deep within himself, Artem suddenly realized something terrible. He wasn't looking at a stranger. He was looking at himself. At his old self. It was his own face, stolen by time, distorted by suffering. This thought was so unbearable that he decided never to approach the puddle again. He locked himself in his room, trying to distract himself with games. But the words, 3 days, rang within him like a bell. He started counting. Today was Tuesday. 3 days, that's Friday. On Wednesday, he woke up screaming. He had dreamed of the old man again. Now he was standing in some familiar place, his face covered in soot and tear tracks, and he was shouting something, addressing him, Artem. Everything around him was burning. The boy could no longer stand it. He had to understand. After school, he approached the puddle again. It was waiting for him. The old man appeared instantly, as if he had never left. Today, his eyes held not only sorrow but also determination. Where? Artem exhaled. The old man in the water silently raised his eyes and looked into the distance. In response, the old man stretched out his hand and touched his own forehead with his finger, then sharply lowered it down into the water. The image rippled. Falling was the last thing he heard. Artem lifted his head and looked carefully at the roof of that building. He saw nothing special, just standard antennas and exhaust pipes. But now the fear had taken on concrete outlines. Something was going to happen on the roof of that building on Friday. Something related to fire. On Thursday, he felt on edge. Every sound seemed like a warning. He tried to find information online about fires, about lightning, but found nothing useful. In the evening, he went to the window and looked at that same 9-story building. The sun was setting, staining the roof a blood-red color. And suddenly he saw it. On the roof, near the edge, stood a small figure. A person. It was too far away to make out the face, but there was something familiar in the posture. That same hopeless fatigue. On Friday, Artem woke up with a stone in his soul. The day was clear, sunny, but that only intensified the horror. He didn't go to school, pretending to be sick. His parents, rushing to work, believed him. He was left home alone. His constant companion was the thought, today. By noon, the sky, as promised by the sunny morning, began to cloud over. First with light, white clouds, then they thickened, becoming gray and heavy. The air became charged with electricity. Artem sat by the window in his room and didn't take his eyes off that roof. He knew it had to happen today. Suddenly his phone vibrated. It was his friend, Dmitro. Artyom, are you home? There was excitement in Dmitro's voice. There's some weirdo near our building. Some old man, old, dirty. He's yelling something about fire and pointing at the roof. Everyone thinks he's crazy. Artem's heart went cold. He ran to the window. Outside, near the entrance of that same 9-story building, he saw a small crowd. And among them, a stooped figure in an old, worn-out coat. He couldn't see the face, but he knew. It was him, the old man from the puddle. Artem didn't remember how he ran out of the apartment and flew down the stairs. He rushed out into the street and ran towards that building. The old man was already surrounded by a few neighbors. He was pale, trembling, his clothes were wet, as if he had fallen into a puddle. But his eyes were the same, full of horror and prophetic knowledge. He looked exactly like he did in the puddle. They don't listen, the old man muttered, and his gaze fell on Artem. And suddenly something flashed in his eyes. Recognition. He saw in Artem not just a boy. He saw his young self. Himself from the past. You, he hissed. You must warn them. It will fall, a spark, everything burns. Then everything happened very quickly. The clouds merged into a single leaden mass. Thunder rumbled. The first heavy drops of rain fell to the ground. The crowd scattered, hiding from the downpour. No one was listening to the old man. In despair, he stretched out his hand to Artem, then turned sharply and, as if obeying some command, ran towards the entrance. He was oddly agile for his age. Stop! Artem shouted and rushed after him. He burst into the entrance just as the elevator doors were closing. The last thing he saw was the old man's desperate gaze through the crack. The elevator, creaking, began to ascend. The display lit up with a floor number. 9. The top floor. The roof. Artem didn't think. He ran up the stairs. His legs felt heavier than lead. His heart was ready to jump out of his chest. He heard the storm raging outside the windows, lightning illuminating the stairwell with flashes. He burst out onto the 9th floor. The door to the attic was open. Wind and rain poured inside. Artem climbed the narrow ladder and found himself on the roof. The wind here was hurricane force. The rain lashed his face like thousands of needles. He could barely stay on his feet. The old man was standing in the middle of the roof, facing the raging elements. He stretched his hands towards the sky, as if meeting his fate. "We have to go down," Artem shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the thunder. The old man turned. There was no fear on his face, only calm and bitter realization. "It cannot be avoided," he shouted back, and Artem barely heard. "It has already happened." At that moment, the sky was torn by a blindingly bright flash. Lightning. It was as if alive, huge, tree-like, and it stretched towards the earth right where they were standing. Artem felt the air around him fill with electricity. His hair stood on end. He instinctively jumped back into the attic room. But the old man remained standing. He didn't try to hide. The lightning struck a metal antenna attached to the roof just a few meters from him. Sparks scattered in a shower. One of them, large and hot, ricocheted and fell right into a pile of old trash, household junk that had been collecting here in the attic for years. Old newspapers, wooden boxes, expired paint. It happened instantly. The dry wood and paper ignited like a match. The fire, fed by the wind, rushed at the old man. His worn-out coat caught fire immediately. Artem screamed, but couldn't look away. He saw how the figure in the flames didn't fall, didn't roll, but stood upright, and at the last moment. The fire spread quickly through the attic. Shouts were heard from below, alarm signals. Artem, coughing from the smoke, ran down the stairs. He was in shock. He had seen his own future die. He had seen his own death. The fire department was called quickly, and the fire was contained only in the attic. But the old man was not saved. When everything quieted down, Artem, still trembling, stood among the crowd of neighbors. One of the firefighters approached him. "What are you doing here, boy? Who was that old man?" Artem didn't know what to answer. He just shook his head silently. He went home, wet, smoke-stained, with an emptiness inside. He turned on the TV. The local news channel was already showing a report. Today, a fire broke out on the roof of a residential building as a result of a lightning strike. One person died. The identity of the deceased is being established. Artem turned off the TV. He went to the window. The rain had stopped. Puddles glittered on the asphalt again. He knew he would never lean over them again. He knew the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a chain of events, a closed circle. The old man from the future had come to warn his past self to prevent his own death. But his death was the event that made him come. A paradox. A dead end. At night, he woke up and went to the bathroom for a drink of water. Without turning on the light, he leaned over the sink. From the dark surface of the water, his own face looked back at him. Childlike, frightened. But for a moment, he thought he saw. Artem turned off the TV. He went to the window. The rain had stopped. Puddles glittered on the asphalt again. He knew he would never lean over them again. He knew the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a chain of events, a closed circle. The old man from the future had come to warn his past self to prevent his own death. Artem turned off the TV. He went to the window. The rain had stopped. Puddles glittered on the asphalt again. He knew he would never lean over them again. He knew the truth. It wasn't an accident. It was a chain of events, a closed circle. The old man from the future had come to warn his past self to prevent his own death. But his death was the event that made him come. A paradox. A dead end. At night, he woke up and went to the bathroom for a drink of water. Without turning on the light, he leaned over the sink. From the dark surface of the water, his own face looked back at him. Childlike, frightened. But for a moment, he thought he saw a shadow in the depths of his eyes. A shadow of knowledge. A shadow of that old man. He straightened up and walked away. But the feeling that the past and the future were just two sides of the same coin, and he, Artem, was trapped on its edge, didn't leave him. Had he prevented a disaster? Or had he caused it himself? Weeks bled into months. His parents noticed the changes. "You're overworked, son," his mother would say, feeling his forehead. "Maybe you need vitamins." They took him to a doctor who prescribed mild sedatives. The pills made him drowsy but didn't protect him from the dreams. They only made them more viscous and inescapable. He was alone with his knowledge. The story of the crazy old man quickly became a local legend, a scary story told by teenagers in the dark. No one connected it with the quiet, withdrawn boy from the next entrance. Artem watched them from his window, listening to their exaggerated, frightened tales, and felt a strange, cold superiority. They were discussing a ghost, but he had met a prophecy. They were afraid of a story, but he was living inside its true, terrible ending. One day, cleaning his room in a fit of desperate attempt to restore order, at least externally, he pulled a large cardboard box from under his bed. It was filled with old toys he hadn't touched for years. The last entry was dated the day of the fire, the 20th September. Today is the day. I know it is. I will go up. I have to see. I have to stop it. Or understand it. He is me, and I am him. The circle must close. Artem dropped the diary as if it were a red-hot coal. It wasn't just a record of recent events. It was a chronicle of his own future. The handwriting, though unfamiliar, was undoubtedly his. The way he formed the letter Y, the slight slant to the left, it was all him, but as if hardened and distorted by years of despair. This diary was a message from his future self, who had already gone through this entire circle and left a record for his past self. But why? To warn? But the warning had failed. To guide? But it had only led to the predicted outcome. A new, even more terrifying theory began to take shape in his mind. What if this wasn't the first time? This realization broke him. He stopped fighting the nightmares. He stopped trying to explain anything to his parents. He simply existed, moving between home and school like an automaton, his inner gaze forever fixed on the burning figure on the roof. The image of the old man's last smile, the smile of liberation, now seemed to him not a sign of acceptance, but a grin of monstrous irony. He was freed from one cycle only to be thrown into the next. Autumn gave way to a cold, slushy winter. Puddles turned to ice. Artem thought it would bring relief, but the ice was just another mirror. One evening, returning from school in the early twilight, he slipped near the same bench. His gloved hand hit the icy surface of a puddle, breaking the thin crust. Beneath it was water, dark and deep. And in that water, for a split second, he saw not his reflection, but a flickering flame. A small, dancing tongue of fire, as if a piece of that rooftop hell had been preserved right here, under the ice.
They are composed of cells and their derivatives and possess specific morphophysiological and biochemical properties. Res. 1.1. Tissues are formed morphologically of cells and intercellular substance. The integumentary or epithelial tissues are located on surfaces bordering the external environment and form the lining of the hollow organs and closed cavities of the body. The main functions of epithelium are tegumentary and secretory. Tissues of the internal environment, or connective tissues, are isolated from the external environment. They differ greatly in properties and are joined in one group on the basis of a common function. Bone tissue is the hardest and strongest, after dental enamel, tissue in the organism.
Artem woke up not with a scream, but with a deep, quiet sob. The dream felt more real than all the previous horrors. For the first time, the old man had spoken to him not as a prophet of doom, but as himself. The question echoed in his mind. Why are you so afraid of me? He was afraid of the old man because the old man was his future. He was afraid of old age, of weakness, of death. He was afraid of that moment of despair and acceptance. The fire was just a symbol, a bright, painful culmination of that fear. The next day, he did something he hadn't done since the fire. He deliberately went to the park and found a frozen puddle. He knelt down and looked. At first, he saw only the cloudy ice and his own pale, exhausted face. But he didn't look away. He peered into his own eyes, into the depths behind them. He was looking for that shadow, and he saw it. Not a vision, not a ghost. It was his own fear, crystallized in his gaze. The fear of becoming that old man. And in that moment, a strange calm came over him. The circle was real, but perhaps its meaning was not to punish him, but to teach him something. To make him accept this part of himself. The future, aging, finite self. He didn't stop being afraid, but the nature of the fear changed. It was no longer a panicky, animal horror, but a heavy, thoughtful sadness. He started looking at old people on the street differently. He saw not just wrinkles and stooped backs, but the weight of lived lives in their eyes. Each of them had once been a boy who had run through puddles. Spring came, the snow melted, and the earth was covered with new, temporary mirrors. Artem walked through the courtyard, now without the former convulsive fear. He approached the first large spring puddle. His heart was beating fast, but it was a different beat. Not the desire to run, but the tension before a meeting. He looked down. The water was clear, reflecting the blue sky and passing clouds. And his own reflection. He stood there for a long time, just looking. It wasn't over. He knew that. The memory was too fresh, the wound too deep. The circle might not be broken, but it had paused. It had given him a respite. Perhaps the question had changed. Or perhaps he had finally started to listen to the answer. He took a step, then another, carefully walking around the puddle. He didn't need to look into it anymore to know what was there. The reflection was no longer in the water. It was inside him, and he had to learn to live with it.